Lots of room. He's 40, like a rocket. Look at Ginty go. Breaks a tackle. He's 20. He's 10. He's touchdown.
Here's a long run. Oklahoma State gonna do it again, and guess who? Big O to the house.
Milroe gonna run it again. Got a lane. Kicked in the turbo. Milroe. Goodbye. Touchdown, Bama.
Pump fake. Cook. End zone. Caught. Touchdown. Luther Burden the third.
This is the CFF Sites Week 9 College Fantasy Football Show. My name's Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF Site. And Week 9 only means one thing. Double-digit weeks are here. We are headed into Week 10. And when those weeks get to double digits, that only means one thing. The end of the season and playoff weeks are on the horizon. Start making those plans if you can. If you're up there, you're padding your lead, playing for seed. Now you have to start looking at the schedule, especially after this week. I mean, look, I've said this all along. Very unusual schedule this year because we're faced with something we haven't been faced with in a very long time, if not ever, and that is 2 bye weeks on every team. The bye weeks have definitely tested your depth. As a matter of fact, what I would say, this is really a chance to reevaluate the roster sizes in your league. If we're going to move forward with every team having 2 byes every season, then what we need to do, if that's the case next year, is you need to maybe lobby your league commissioner to possibly expand rosters by at least another roster spot, just to give you some more options for some of these bye weeks. I mean, we're looking at bye weeks this year where we've had as many as 30 teams on a bye, I think at least twice. This week, another heavy bye week. This isn't going to change. This is going to be the norm. We're going to have to adapt, it seems like. And it's been quite an unusual year for that because depth is tested. Injuries always play a part of college fantasy football. I know it's frustrating, but injuries have just always been there because what makes college fantasy football frustrating from an injury standpoint is we just don't get injury reports across the board on all FBS schools. It's just the lay of the land. It always has been like that. And, you're still going to get burned nowadays, which is why I say sometimes you have to be safe than sorry, particularly this time of the year when games really, you can't afford to lose games now. Maybe that type of decision cost you a matchup in week 2 or 3. And yeah, every game matters as you look at the standings, but now's the time, particularly as you get into the playoffs, where you have to make sure that guys are playing unless you have some type of auto subsystem in place. And look, you've got to get going early. We're going to have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday matchup games all year long. Now, I have a thought on that. I'm not a big fan of the Tuesday night games. I get it. It gives some schools and some conferences some exposure. But if you watched those games last week between San Jose State and FIU and UTEP and Louisiana Tech, those games they don't do college football any good. They actually do them a disservice because college football is so great on Saturdays, and it's because there's such a high volume of games. There's so many games that you're going to get a healthy handful that at any time of the day, you can flip the channel and you're probably going to get a really good finish. But not with these Tuesday games. And I'll be honest with you, I see better football on a Friday night when I go watch my daughter cheer at the local high school. I see better games out there on Friday night than I do on Tuesday nights. It's just a shame, but we have to sit through some of those Sam Houston State, FIU, UTEP, Louisiana Tech matchups. I don't like the Tuesday, Wednesday games. I get why schools like them, but I just don't think it works for college football. I really don't. And then, of course, on the flip side of that, you have schools like Jackson State who plays early, and then you've got guys like Trey Stewart and Tyler Huff. They pop off, and I get that. You're going to have, you got to take the bad with the good. And when you look at the Thursday games, and look, I know Thursday college football is a staple. That's not going anywhere. That's for sure. So much hope for fantasy potential in that Syracuse Pitt matchup. 3 pick sixes completely flipped the fantasy value of players on that game on its head. And a name we talked about on the last couple of shows, Old Dominion quarterback Colton Joseph really stole the night from a fantasy standpoint for Old Dominion. All the attention on the Pitt Syracuse game, and those of you guys that started Colton Joseph, quarterback Old Dominion, was certainly treated. So let's just go through a few games. I'm going to give you my thoughts here or there, maybe about some teams in regards to their college football playoff chances, maybe their schedule, how that relates to college fantasy football. We'll talk about the Heisman at the end as well, what's going on with that, jockeying for position. I don't necessarily think there's a clear favorite. And, it's something interesting that I noticed in the media in regards to the Heisman voting, or at least the Heisman odds. But let's just continue down the slate. We'll get into the Saturday matchups. And look, as we get deeper and deeper into the season, there's just fewer things to talk about, fewer things that are going to jump out. But we're going to get into stuff like the Texas running back situation. I have thoughts about Minnesota running back Darius Taylor as well. We'll get there. But I mentioned on leading up to, I think, last week's show as well, with Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart really just started out super hot. 3 TDs in his last 4 games. There's a lot of fantasy owners out there wondering whether or not they should even start Jackson Dart moving forward. I cannot argue that point. I mean, he's just literally, he's not getting any work inside the 5-yard line like he was earlier on during the year. They got that Pegas guy coming in. He's vulturing touchdowns not only from Dart, but from Henry Parrish as well. And Dart's racking up the yards, but 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. You really have to wonder, is he somebody that you want to start moving forward over the next couple of weeks? Just an observation I made for the Washington Huskies. They're sitting at 4-4. They're 2 wins away from bowl eligibility. So I think for you guys that have Denzel Boston, the games that you really are targeting are against USC and UCLA. Washington has 2 road games at Penn State and at Oregon. I can't see them winning either one of those games, which means that they have to go balls to the wall against USC and UCLA to get the 6 wins, to get the bowl eligibility. Something to consider if you like gambling out there. Ohio State, was it a look-ahead game for them against Nebraska to Penn State? I don't know. Possibly. I'm really curious to see how this matchup plays out. It's obviously the biggest game of the weekend. And from the Penn State point of view, they have Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, and Maryland left on the schedule after this week. When you look at Penn State's schedule, I just really am not sure who Penn State has really beaten this year that has been very good to say that they are indeed one of the top 5 teams in the country. But I don't see them losing outside of this game against Ohio State unless they get upset. So I think Penn State's going to be in the college football playoff no matter what they do this weekend, because I just can't see a loss on their schedule given who they play. With that being said, let's talk about running back Nicholas Singleton. Is he completely healthy? That's debatable. But he's got 3 rushing touchdowns, 4 receiving touchdowns. He actually has more receiving touchdowns than rushing touchdowns this year. But that should just be a good game to watch. From a fantasy standpoint, for me, I just think the most valuable fantasy assets will continue to be Will Howard and Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka at Ohio State. It even feels like the running backs for Ohio State have lost a ton of fantasy value as well. But for me, those are the 3 big names. And of course, Tyler Warren, tight end at Penn State. And I still think you have to start Nicholas Singleton, even though Katron Allen's getting some run. I feel like if you're in a position where you have to play them, it's okay. They're going to have to score. They're going to need at least a couple, 2 or 3 touchdowns. And if they score 2 or 3, you have to feel pretty good that Singleton's probably going to get one of those scores. I think the biggest question for Penn State is Drew Allar going to play? Is he going to be healthy? We'll find out on that. Let's skip over to a group of 5 team, UTSA, where, Owen McCown has thrown for 774 yards the last 2 games. He's got 9 passing TDs in the last 3 games. If you're looking for a quarterback and you need some depth at quarterback, that might be a guy to reach for this week if you need a sleeper. They play Memphis this week. UTSA plays Memphis. Memphis has given up a ton of points I think they've given up at least 28 in 3 of their last 5. And, they've won 2 games, I think, recently, or 2 in the last 5. They've given up 40 plus. Could be a sleeper pick for you this week if you're desperate at quarterback. Let's go over to TCU, where Cam Cook seems to be a foregone conclusion now. Savion Williams leading the team in rushing for 2 consecutive weeks. I have to be honest, I haven't really put TCU under the microscope that much to see if whether or not their style of play is changing, and that's led to Jack Bech having fewer than 77 or fewer receiving yards in each of the last 3 games. He's still one of a handful of players that are averaging over 100 receiving yards per game. But the last 3 games, he's sort of trending down. Curious to see where he goes next game to see if we can get a rebound or if that's going to be the trend from now to the end of the year. And while we're talking about trends, how about the positive trend on Baylor quarterback Sawyer Robertson? 3 passing touchdowns in each of the last 4 games has completely turned around that Baylor offense, and he's a starting option for you moving forward. And Oklahoma State running back Ollie Gordon II. Let's go there. Is he back? Back-to-back 2 touchdown games. And I would imagine there's a lot of guys that started him after that 2 touchdown game a couple of weeks ago against BYU. Good for you if you started him again. Good for you if you're getting some production out of Ollie Gordon. That was overdue. You invested a lot of draft capital, early draft pick. I'd like to really see him finish strong. But you know what? I'm going to stop for a second and from a fantasy standpoint, just pause and just say, if Ollie Gordon was really banged up in the preseason, like we had heard some reports that he wasn't sure, but I could tell you right now, maybe he wasn't healthy at the beginning of the year. Maybe he battled through injuries. All I know is the Oklahoma State offensive line was not giving him any help. He was banged up throughout that BYU game. I know he got banged up again this past weekend. If anything, Ollie Gordon II has just been a warrior, man. That guy is playing through some whatever he's got to play through, and hopefully he can continue to produce down the stretch for you fantasy owners. I'm really hoping that, but I really just want to admire his toughness battling through what's been a rough year, but really, hopefully, coming out of the smoke a little bit and can produce for you guys here down the stretch. A guy that's really produced all year. I've been on him since the beginning of the year. One of the hits that I did have, Juwan Newton. A touchdown in 7 of 8 games this year, 3 multi-touchdown games, has just been consistent at receiver for Toledo. Now let's stay in the MAC and go over to Northern Illinois. Is Ontario Brown back and healthy? We'll see. 2 TDs in the win against Ball State. It was against Ball State, but an encouraging sign if you have Ontario Brown, running back NIU, moving forward. And while we're on the topic of running backs, let's go over to Minnesota. Because the one thing that I noticed with Minnesota is probably a lot of you guys have noticed as well. That Darius Taylor was having a very, very less than average game last week against Maryland until he popped a 51-yard TD run. If you take away that 51-yard run, he would have had 14 rush attempts for 30 yards. You have to understand, Minnesota. This is not the Minnesota of the recent Minnesota teams where Darius Taylor is getting that high volume, and Minnesota's just been super productive on the ground. It feels like this year, at least, Darius Taylor's not going to be running up the 30 carry games for 200 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns. But I have to say this, considering where most of you guys drafted him, and given that he was banged up at the beginning of the year, which made a lot of fantasy owners nervous on whether or not it was going to be a long-term injury, you have to at least feel decent for what you're getting out of Taylor every week, especially if you drafted him in a PPR league, because he has been very active in the passing game this year, has a ton of receptions. And so Taylor has been more of a well-rounded fantasy asset this year than more of the 30 carry high volume production guy that we thought we were going to get going into the season. And going into the season, Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden was one of the highest rated receivers, if not the highest rated receivers on the board. I know he's had a rushing touchdown in the last couple of weeks, but he hasn't caught a touchdown. He hasn't caught a touchdown pass in 4 consecutive games. And then as you look at the next 3 weeks, and I think he's only got one 100-yard game on the season. Next 3 weeks, Missouri has a bye, so you're not going to get anything from him this week. They get Oklahoma the following week, which we've spoken about. Oklahoma has a decent defense. And then they go to South Carolina the following week, which again, South Carolina has a pretty decent defense as well. 2 possible games that Missouri could lose, and those are not great matchups for Burden in that Missouri offense. I'd like to think that any matchup's a good matchup for Burden, but it just seems like they have not been able to get him the ball often this year, or at least lately in some of these bigger games. So I have a concern if you have Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden moving forward over the next 3 weeks. After that, the last 2 weeks, the schedule clears up. Could be really good for you in the playoffs, but you may have a little bit of a struggle over the next 3 weeks. Let's move over to Cal, running back Jaden Ott, which I have to tell you, Jaden Ott's really one of those players that have just been banged up all year. Now, the Javian Thomas has been really, has been very good substituting in for Ott. Ott has been banged up, and I think Ott's been battling injuries all year. And now here's where I'm at with Ott. There's a possibility after a bye week, because he did play this past week, that maybe he gets healed up enough over this bye week that November 8th matchup at Wake Forest could be a breakout game for Ott this year if he's fully healthy. However, given Thomas's production, you have to wonder now moving forward, is there a chance where they're just going to split carries moving forward? Ott's one of those players where I think if you have him, maybe you dangle him out there as draft bait and say, hey, listen, he's productive. He's going to start. He's going to get healthy. He's on a bye. I'll dangle him out there for a player that you need if you have him. If you don't have him, maybe he's a guy that you take a stab and say, hey, you know what? After a bye week, maybe he regains full health. Maybe he has a couple of those breakout games that can really be electric down the stretch. Ott, to me, is a little bit of a wild card heading down the stretch, a little bit of a joker play. I think he could be really good, or he could just be stuck in a 50-50 situation moving forward. If I had to roll the dice one way or the other, I'd rather roll the dice that he's going to be really good and healthy coming out of a bye week and put some things together. I think your better days could be ahead if you're a Jaden Ott owner. I got some thoughts on Texas. I'll finish up there. So let's go to Utah State, where some of you fantasy owners have to be incredibly heartbreaking. To lose a receiver like Jalen Royals at this point of the system is just really, really tough. I mean, you went from losing what was arguably the best wide receiver in college fantasy football over the last 4 weeks, and now you have to replace that. That's really hard to replace, even if you were able to even scoop up a guy like Otto Tia, who had a breakout game or a good game for Utah State this weekend. With Royals being out, I just don't know if he's going to put up Royals-like number, and it's very difficult to make that up. So my heart goes out to you guys that have him. Texas A&M. Let's talk about that game against LSU, and really the reason why I bring it up, it's like it's hard for me to see A&M getting away from Marcel Reed. He just looks so electric in that backfield. I know he's young, but Texas A&M's very physical, and he just gives that offense a different dynamic. Now, does he kill the fantasy values of Moss and Daniels? I'm not quite sure. I think he might actually make them better, because there's going to have to be the defenses are going to have to key in on Reed as well. So I don't think things fall off for you fantasy owners of Le'Veon Moss, even if Marcel Reed is the quarterback. Going over to Kansas State, DJ Giddens. Let's talk about him. He's on pace to run for 1,300 yards this year, but he only has 4 touchdowns to date. That was one where I thought DJ Giddens was almost surely going to be in the double-digit touchdown mark, and he was one of those guys where you look at Kansas State offense, and I know you've got Avery Johnson there, but you just he, to me, was one of those guys at the beginning of the year where he looked like he would be almost a given for 15, 20 touchdowns. 4 touchdowns at this point of the season is just a little hard luck for the fantasy owners out there. And look, no different with Cincinnati running back Corey Kiner. He ran for 1,000 yards last year, only had he ran for 1,047 yards, 5 touchdowns on the season. This year, he's on pace to eclipse the 1,000-yard mark once again. He's only got 2 rushing touchdowns. So he's not on a pace to best last year's 5 touchdowns. And you're looking at a player that's probably going to go back-to-back 1,000 yards and may not get to 10 touchdowns in 2 seasons. Let's go over to Colorado. Actually, you know what? Yeah, with Colorado, let me say this. Travis Hunter, phenomenal, 2-touchdown game. That Colorado offense is definitely different. Now, if I'm not going to suggest go out and pick up Isaiah Auguste, the running back who is, even though he has scored in 3 straight games on the ground, but it is nice to see, like from a fantasy perspective, if you have Shedeur Sanders, you don't like to see Colorado become more balanced, but Colorado looks like a better team with the way that they're playing on offense right now. And I have to call them, where I missed them too. I stayed away from Colorado at the beginning of the year because I was afraid they could turn into a dumpster fire by this time of the year. I'm going to give credit where credit's due. Props to head coach Deion Sanders. He is staying under the radar. He's staying off of, he's not doing anything that I think would make people dislike him. And Colorado's playing solid football. He's got a good team. And you know what? He's laying low. And I like that. Find myself now where I was against Colorado at the beginning of the year, kind of pulling for them. I hope they kind of stay in that zone where they're at. And I'm going to get back to Travis Hunter when we talk about the Heisman in a minute, because I want to talk about Texas running back situation with Trey Wisner, Jaden Blue. And, right when we thought, look, I feel that Wisner is the starting running back and is going to be there. But there were some moments last week when I saw Blue get the ball and I was just like, man, he just looks more electric with the ball. He just looks more explosive with the ball. Whether or not that's going to hold up, I really don't know. But here's my thought about Texas. I feel like they're just, and this is in relation to the college football playoff. I feel like they're just missing something. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's maybe because their wide receiver core getting reshuffled. I don't know if it's because, they lost Baxter and then all of a sudden Blue was there, banged up Wisner, and we can't really figure out who the running back one and do they really have a running back one. But they get 3 games to figure it out. Florida, at Arkansas, Kentucky. Be tough to see Texas losing one of those games. I don't think they're going to win them all easy, though, because I feel like there's just something missing with Texas right now. They've got 3 games to clean it up. But after watching that LSU A&M game last week, man, I just realized we get Texas at Texas A&M at the end of the year. Holy cow. What a game that could be if for somehow, some way, Texas and A&M lose a game somewhere along the line, and the loser of that game probably eliminates the other from the college football playoff. Oof. Boy, that's going to be a treat to see that rivalry game. Let's go to the Heisman. Before I go to the Heisman, I'm going to tease out. I'm going to talk about the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. I didn't do that at the top of the show. I want to do that for you guys that are playing, that are still alive, because there's a lot of good things going on in that I want to hype it up for you guys that didn't get in and are thinking about playing it for next year. But let's talk about the Heisman race. And one thing I noticed, I even did this in my notes and observations. Ashton Genty's game against UNLV, it was against UNLV. And even though UNLV is a solid Group of 5 opponent, Ashton Genty really needs to run up the stats for me in order to win the Heisman Trophy. But that's the same thing that Cam Ward's doing over at Miami, because I don't really see anybody on that Miami schedule. Like that Miami schedule, just I don't know how they're not, they're going to continue to run up points. But what more shocking was that Cam Ward didn't even account for 1 touchdown this past week. And in my notes and observation, I mentioned that how, with Cam Ward's subpar production, or really no production this past week, and Ashton Genty, what you would consider 130 yards and a touchdown, a bad game for him, because you feel like, he's no longer on that Barry Sanders pace, right? That it kind of opens the door for Travis Hunter to get back into the conversation after 2 touchdown receptions. But the one thing that I noticed, and I noticed this with a lot of the sports personalities out there, they go ahead and update their Heisman race every week. And it's funny how many guys just moved Travis Hunter all the way to the top of the list now because of 2 touchdowns, and Cam Ward didn't do anything, and Ashton Genty, you know, ran for 130 plus and a touchdown. And I'm just thinking to myself, why? I don't know. Maybe I'm the one making a mistake because I'm really playing the game too, where I'm just kind of talking about it, but I'm not really I'm not ready to anoint somebody the Heisman Trophy just because they have one game, and the whole mixture of the rankings, takes on a different look for just one game. It's a collective body of work that we need to look at the end of the year. We'll see how that plays out. But I do think, Travis Hunter is a unique talent, arguably the most electric player in college football right now. But there's still, we still have week 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 to go. We have a lot of football to play before we settle on the Heisman Trophy winner. So there's a long way to go. But, again, I think Cam Ward right now is in pole position just because I think Miami looking at their schedule, I just don't know how many games they're actually going to lose. And I think Ward's going to be winning games and putting up big numbers. Genty's going to make, if he can get Boise into the college football playoff as a G5 team, maybe. But I think he'll be tough I think it'll be tough for him to beat Ward if he cannot. And I just think Travis Hunter, when it comes down to it, unless Ward just fizzles at the end of the year, it's going to be hard for me, I think, for anybody to pass up Cam Ward, even maybe Dillon Gabriel now, who might be an outside shot just because Oregon running the table. But we'll see how that plays out. Now let's go into the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, and congratulations to all of you guys in it. 83 teams started off in this league, but let me just tell you how it can change on a dime, and everything changed in week 9 because the number one seed, the number one team overall in the total standings that won the first half of the two halves tournament, they got the number one seed in the second half of the two halves tournament. They were the number one seed in the head-to-head tournament, and they were alive in the eliminator. They had such a bad week this week that they were eliminated from every league. They were eliminated from the eliminator, the second half of the two halves tournament, and the head-to-head tournament. So they're still sitting in the championship game after winning the first half tournament, and they're still sitting on top of the total point standings, but they just got gouged. And not only that, the second place team, I think, in the total point standings made up 70 points this past week. If you're sitting within the top 20 to 25 in the total point standings in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, you have a shot. The difference between the team that was leading in the standings this past week and the highest scoring team for the week was the difference of like 230 points. With the bye weeks having such a huge impact on rosters, the 4-1 Super Fantasy League is far from over. Of the 82 teams that entered and started, only 3 teams of the 82 still are in contention for all 4 leagues. That's it. There's only 3 teams of the 84. So congrats to all of you guys. But look, that 4-1 Super Fantasy League, I get it. It's a lot of maintenance, but for you guys that love it, that are diehards, man, if you're in the top 20 to 25, don't give up on that now, because go back to the week 9 standings and look at the difference between the leader going into the week and the highest scoring team. The difference was like 230 points. If you can make up 230 points in one week and you're sitting there in like 15th place, you're probably in the top 5 going into the last 4 weeks of the season. So 4-1 Super Fantasy League, we're down to the wire, but man, there's still a ton of teams left in the eliminator. You still got head-to-head, two halves tournament, total points. I think overall, when you consider all 4 leagues, there are probably about 30-something teams that realistically still have a shot to win one of those leagues. So the good luck to you guys moving forward. Look, that's going to do it for week 9. We are getting into double-digit weeks, and the double-digit weeks are the money weeks. Starts to become do or die now. Roster decisions. Every roster decision that you make is crucial. Every start bench decision that you make is magnified. Good luck to everybody in week 10. I'll see you next week.